Welcome back, everyone. We are having a very technically savvy workshop right now, but we're happy to connect with Dr. Bob Rosenthal. He's down in UC Riverside. And I think since everything's working just fine, Bob, you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, my name is Bob Rosenthal. I'm here at UCR and been here for 17 years. And I can't tell you how happy I am to be at this wonderful occasion, the inaugural run of a wonderful new organization that's going to help make the social sciences a whole lot better than they are. They're pretty good now, but they can be a whole lot better. And BITS is helping a lot to bring that about. So thank you for allowing me to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. So as Ted spoke of earlier today, I mean, really this is just an exciting day for us to have the inaugural Leamer-Rosenthal Prize recipients here today. So I think to kick things off, Ted Miguel is going to come back to the stage and introduce the first set of winners, the leaders in education. So if I could have you come up.
Great, thanks everybody for coming back. And it was great to have Bob's presence here briefly. I think hopefully he'll be back on the line for the Q&A later. The first round of Leamer-Rosenthal prizes for open social science this year has two categories. We wanted to recognize emerging young researchers, and we'll be hearing about those prizes in a second. We also wanted to recognize leaders in education, folks who are putting in place new curricula, new training programs, and in that way are really shifting the field. So I'm first going to introduce the two winners in the leaders in education category. Neither of them were able to come today. So I'm just going to describe their work. We'll applaud for them again. They'll hear it wherever they are, hopefully. And then we have the sort of in the flesh leaders in the emerging researcher category, and we actually have prizes here, so it's going to be pretty cool. The nominations we received in the leaders in education category came across the social sciences. Again, it was really inspiring just to see how much work is going on in this area. And the two prizes this year are going to two faculty who have really had tremendous impact. The first recipient is Dr. Scott Long, Distinguished Professor and Chancellor's Professor of Sociology and Statistics at Indiana University in Bloomington. Let me just read something from Scott's statement, because it speaks to his motivation for doing work in this area. He says, "My interest in open science began in graduate school when I attempted to replicate results from a well-known paper published in a leading journal. After I received several versions of the data that did not reproduce the paper's findings, the author wrote, I must have lost the original files. Since then, I've taught thousands of students and consulted with hundreds of researchers, and I've become increasingly aware of the fragility of published research. For class projects, I sometimes have students try to reproduce published analyses," and so on. Since 2008, he's given dozens of talks on reproducible research. He delivers a campus-wide workshop on methods, including a talk, Reproducible Results and the Workflow of Data Analysis, which hundreds of students have attended. And he's authored several very high-impact textbooks, a textbook called The Workflow of Data Analysis Using Stata that I think many of you here are familiar with. And he's actually been involved with Richard Ball and Norm over at Haverford to develop their curriculum with the TIER project, which we've been partners with. TIER and BITS have partnered for a few years now, and Scott has worked with them. So I think if you look over the last few years, Scott's had so much influence in different types of education and training. He's affected thousands of students and begun to implement the kinds of changes in norms and norm shifts that we're all aiming for. So even though he's not here, maybe we can have a round of applause for all of Scott's work in this area. The second recipient of the Leaders in Education category is Dr. Philip Stark, who's a professor of statistics and actually the chair of statistics here at University of California, Berkeley. Professor Stark has developed new statistics courses that focus explicitly on reproducible and transparent statistical practices. And he did this a number of years ago. So he's really, I think, ahead of the curve on that. These include upper division undergraduate courses, graduate courses, and the course, I don't think he's teaching it this year, but the course lives on. It's now a standard part of the statistics curriculum, Statistics 259 here at Berkeley. So he's really institutionalized and mainstreamed the teaching of these methods to students at a major statistics department. He's an innovator in other dimensions as well. He spearheaded the organization of a workshop organized by the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. They're called BIDS here at Berkeley. It wasn't planned, obviously, but we do work with them as well. He also he worked on the creation of what's called the Berkeley Common Environment, a virtual reproducible computational environment for doing rigorous statistical research. So he's worked on the education side, the tool development side, and again, just reached hundreds and hundreds of students so far. So maybe we can also have a round of applause for Philip Stark. One of the things we hope to do with these prizes is not just, again, recognize leaders in the field, but also bring other folks into the field. And I think these two recipients, Professors Long and Stark, really set a high bar that all of us hopefully can aspire to for the teaching of these methods in our own courses. Okay, the next set of prizes are the Emerging Researcher prizes. This category focuses on early career researchers, junior faculty, postdoctoral researchers, advanced graduate students who are themselves pioneering and developing new approaches to transparent social science research. And as usual, it's really among the young scholars, the new PhDs, the graduate students that the most innovative work is being done by. So it was really inspiring to read through the dozens and dozens of nominations that came in. It was a very arduous process. There were so many exciting things going on, and I think the folks that we're recognizing today are incredibly inspiring. The first Emerging Researcher Prize recipient is Dr. Sean Grant, Associate Behavioral and Social Scientist at the RAND Corporation down in Southern California. For his doctoral dissertation at the University of Oxford, Dr. Grant led the methodological development of a new tool for transparently reporting randomized control trials of social and psychological interventions, what's called Consort SPI. I think people here are probably familiar with the medical equivalent, the Consort, the influential Consort or Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials statement, but those norms may not all apply to the social and behavioral sciences. And I think for those of us that do field experiments in the social sciences, our constraints are different, our interests are different, our models are different. And what Sean has done in extending and adapting this well-accepted standard and bringing them into the social and behavioral sciences is incredibly important. And he did that work while he was a graduate student. He led a formal consensus meeting of dozens of researchers and journal editors to select sort of final items for the Consort SPI checklist. He's continued to work on these themes since finishing his PhD. He's writing articles on reporting standards of behavioral interventions. He's also doing actually another empirical project on pre-registration of psychological intervention trials. He's really working in his own research on a range of these topics while he's also taking a leadership role in the adoption of new standards. And he did most of this while he was still a PhD student. So it was incredibly inspiring to read about his work. He's also an editor of a journal, an associate editor of a journal already, even just a couple years out of his PhD, and he's focusing on improving the transparency practices of that journal. So, again, a very inspiring case, someone who's a current leader in the field. Join me in congratulating Dr. Sean Grant. It is transparent. Great.
So before I advance, I want to make some comments about what I think are the two big issues that are on the table today or that face economics. And I like to call them data mining and phishing. So data mining means digging into the deeper and deeper into the same data set, hoping you're going to find a nugget of truth in there somewhere. And it's a social process because you might be doing some mining, but there's like 100 or maybe 1,000 other miners who are working at the same time. And when that gold is discovered, is it real or not? That's what I was talking about this morning. Sort of imposing measures of that attempt to control that social process. I like what Paul Romer had to say about it being a social learning process that we're engaged in. Ultimately, that's what we want to know. How do people form their judgments, and what role does data mining play in forming the judgments of economists? I'm inclined to think that most of what we believe is theoretical, and then we do data mining to confirm that belief rather than to alter people's beliefs very much. And that's kind of disappointing. It's not a science in the sense of being empirically changeable. I like to think of it as mathematical philosophy is what economics is. Still, it's a powerful way of thinking. After all, the invisible hand is just a theory, yet you all believe it because it's compelling and persuasive logic. It's persuasion that we do. So mining is what I talked about this morning, but the other issue that this award addresses is phishing. So phishing is when you go from pool to pool hoping you're going to find a great new result, one data set to another data set. I remember long ago I read that left-handers die 5 years earlier than right-handers. I said, how could that be? You know, that was in a newspaper. And somebody had studied the turn of the last century pitchers in baseball, and you knew who was left-handed and who was right-handed at that time, so you could determine what the lifetimes of all those pitchers were. And indeed, the statistics were statistically significant and rather alarming. Well, the treatment of that problem is to pool that with all the other information that you have about left-handers. It'd be extraordinary to think that there was a 5-year gap between left-handers and right-handers. We didn't know that already, you know. So obviously there's a lot of data that needs to be brought to bear. When you do phishing, when you do one pool, you're going to have one level of p-value that is appropriate. You do 30 pools, maybe you need to do a different kind of analysis to adjust for the fact that you looked in these other pools. Our researcher whose name I'm going to use in a minute, has used a Bayesian hierarchical model for studying the meta-analysis, for studying basically, I think, of pooling across data sets. And she has this website that is called AidGrade, which allows you to do your own pooling. And it takes as inputs the results from lots of different studies, including standard errors. And then it pools them all together using a hierarchical model. The hierarchical model assumes that the treatment effect, comes from a distribution. And the goal is to estimate the mean and variance of that distribution. If that variance is big of that hyperparameter, then there's not much pooling. It's the small variance case where you're going to have a lot of pooling. And in the cases that she has studied, that I think the message is that there's a heck of a lot of heterogeneity out there and not too much room for the pooling. This is ultimately a matter of transferability, I think, which is not so much in a fora when it comes to observational data, but critical in experimental settings, particularly when you talk about social processes. You know, social experiments are rather different from physical experiments because humans are interacting in a real way. Certainly in the real world they are. So the ability to transfer from one setting to another, or the failure to transfer because there's a heck of a lot of heterogeneity, that's extremely important. You might have found that left-handers, baseball pitchers, maybe there was something about them that actually produced that outcome, but you'd like to know what that actually is. So I repeat, I like this idea of that Paul Romer talked about, which is to evaluate social learning impact, social learning in terms of its effect, not what I report in my regression paper, but how that affects you, how that persuades you, because ultimately that's what we're doing, trying to persuade each other, create some kind of a core that we mostly believe in, and some fringe opinions that some of us believe and some of us don't. So that toward that end, the meta-analysis is very, very important. The emerging researcher award recipient in economics is Eva Vivalt, who's an assistant professor at the Australian National University, visiting at Stanford, I guess, now. She says yes. There were a total of 38 nominations in this emerging researcher category. 7 of them were in economics. Dr. Vivalt stood out as an innovator, as demonstrated by her leadership in founding AirGrade, a U.S. nonprofit research institute that gathers data from impact evaluations of development programs and synthesize the data through open, living meta-analysis. Another force for good. I mean, people ignored me because there was no consequence of ignoring me. But if you start to put pressure, find ways that make it more uncomfortable to ignore, which is, I think, what BITS, the fundamental message I'm getting about BITS is it's going to have an impact because it's going to be hard to ignore all this stuff going forward. The living data analysis allows for constant updating of the meta-analysis results, which is critical as well. The main results from hundreds of studies can be downloaded and analyzed on AidGrade's website. Make sure you visit this, very important new tool. She's created that infrastructure for others, but she continuously generated new analysis from this. And I read a couple of these papers. They're very well written, and there's a lot of content to them. So I encourage you to take a look at the papers that have been written by this awardee. And one thing that she commented on, that she has commented on in these papers, something that resonates with me, is the gap between different studies' results point to the need for researchers to put their work in context and try to understand what is driving their results. That's the, God, I drew a blank on his name. What's the guy who just won the Nobel Prize at Princeton? Angus Deaton. His view is you need to know the mechanism. Jim Heckman too. You have to know the mechanism in these experimental settings in order to know how it transfers to other settings. That's the context. So you can't just do meta-analysis. You got to understand what the variables are that drive the differences between the different results. That ultimately you got to understand the context and which allows you to do better pooling and also to do better projections into new settings. What's a structural variable and what is not is another way of asking that question. So in a paper titled How Much Can We Generalize from Impact Evaluation, she discusses several measures that one could use to gauge heterogeneity and explain how careful modeling of results and the consideration of the effect of sampling variance would reduce the observed heterogeneity. Sampling variance means that you put low weight on the high variance results. So you need that, and often results are not published with the sampling variance information. She also studies the specification searches. I was reading this because I was wondering how she dealt with model ambiguity, because I think that all these regression results have a lot of model ambiguity, and you might do a meta-analysis not just on statistical uncertainty, but model ambiguity as well. If I get this right, I'm not sure I have it completely understood. She resolves that model ambiguity problem, meaning that in any given paper there are many regressions that are reported. She has an algorithm by which she selects the one to do the data analysis. But the fact that there are others opens the possibility of doing some meta-analysis with regard to model ambiguity as well. So that's an overlap between myself and her, which I find appealing. Beyond innovation and research, her practices in transparency are extending to the classroom. In her development economics course for undergraduate seniors at Stanford, they discuss research transparency in class, and students are expected to write pre-analysis plans, upload them to OSF, and write a summary of how their approach diverged from their plans. Please join me in recognizing Dr. Eva Vivalt for this award.
Hi, I'm Bobby Spellman. I'm a psychologist. I've been asked to give 2 awards for the emerging researchers in psychology. One of the things I find really interesting about coming to the BITS meetings is comparing across economics, political science, psychology, biostatistics, all the other fields that are represented here, similarities and differences across our fields. And I've even heard this morning somebody say, oh, field X is different because we do something in the following way. And I thought to myself, this is a perfect example of what psychologists would call an in-group, out-group bias, where you know about your own group how wide and disparate everything everybody is doing is, but everybody else's group looks exactly the same across them. And when I was thinking about it, I kind of started drafting little notes about similarities and differences across the different fields. And I just wanted to remark that, in all of our fields, we have people who do research and people who do theory. We have experimentalists and non-experimentalists. We have people who deal with small numbers of subjects, participants, groups, whatever you want to call them, and large numbers. We have people who want to aggregate big bunches of data, people who want to explore small bunches. We have miners and fishers. And at least in most of these fields, I'm not sure if it's all, we have people who like math and people who don't like math. And that's certainly the case in the diversity in psychology. Another thing that's common across the fields is we all had pressure from our fields to do things different ways, certainly to publish, certainly things about how to get tenure or not get tenure. And I think one of the lessons that I've been learning from here and other places is that, we've known for a long time as psychologists, and you in other fields as well, that, we all have biases in ourselves. We're all looking, our research is great. We would never do anything wrong. But we're not always so aware of what we're doing ourselves. So we have this need to be transparent, not only to others, but to ourselves. And that's why we have some of these goals of putting things up and of pre-commitment and of being open and doing open science. And I am really impressed with the two people I'm giving awards to today for their acknowledgement of that in what they do. I'm going to put forward one way I think psychology might be different, but feel free to tell me I'm wrong, is that at least in some fields of psychology, and I would include judgment and decision making with this, and I don't know if there are any behavioral economists here as well, but I see it there sometimes too, is that we have a very ease of data collection, small numbers of subjects that can just be students in our university, or they can be on MTurk or online samples, and we just ask them a bunch of questions and ask them to imagine that they own a mug or have thought about a thing or have been mugged in a mug, whatever. And how would they react and what would they do? And we can do these things often and quickly and get our samples and say, oh, I asked the question wrong, I'll do it again. I did something wrong, I'll do it again. And finally decide, oh, I did it right when I got the data that I wanted or that confirmed my hypothesis. And I think that's a big challenge in psychology, is to make sure that we're a little more honest about doing that. So the way my two awardees have contributed to that is, first I'm going to talk about Etienne. I think that's a very nice picture. Etienne is a professor of experimental psychology at the University of Western Ontario. And he exemplifies what I think are two really important qualities of everybody who's gotten the awards today, which is that they do it and that they enable others to do it. So Etienne has been involved in open science himself in many ways. He's practiced it in his own research. He's been part of major research programs on it, so parts of reproducibility projects and things like that. He's spoken about it and he's written about it. And that's great, but that's not what we give the awards for. That's the first stepping stone in this. Etienne has helped to develop two web-based sites that I think show insight into how you can lead by enabling people to do what they want to do. So I think among the younger generation, there's a real desire to want to do open science, to want to share, to tell people what they do. I mean, is this being taped? Shit. If you're gonna sext, you shouldn't be afraid to put your data on the web, okay? So if people want to do open science, what would you want to let them do? So early on, Etienne developed a website called psychdisclosure.org, and that allowed researchers to disclose more methodological details of their research before it could be published. So we all know that in publication in psychology, and I assume in other fields as well, sometimes the journals would say, oh, shorten your article. We can't give you this much space. And it's pretty easy to shorten your method, or to shorten the analyses that didn't work out, or to shorten by cutting back on reporting all the variables that you measured because some of them didn't work. And indeed, in psychology over the years, it had been encouraged, oh, leave that stuff out, nobody cares, right? So Etienne developed this website, and people would just put up the rest of their methods there. And that inspired the previous editor-in-chief of Psychological Science, one of the premier journals in psychology, to say, you know what, we ought to be doing this ourselves at our journal. We ought to be having online supplements and allowing that. And actually, the new version of this is to allow methods. There's no word limit on explaining your methods, and maybe on your analyses. I'm not sure about that yet. But we want people to be able to do that. So leading by letting people do what they want to do. And more recently, he's founded curatescience.org, which is a web application to facilitate and incentivize the independent verification of public scientific findings. So again, people can put up their research and look at it, share it with each other, have other people analyze it, and gives rewards for open materials and pre-registration. This enables people to discuss it. And I think it illustrates how people want to do this, and how we should be, proud of our ideas and our data and what we've accomplished, instead of trying to sweep under the rug the things that don't actually look perfect. So thank you so much for helping us out in the field. And Etienne, do I have a thing? Where's my backup? Does it have a name? They're not named? No. Don't be so tall, please. The second person I get to give an award to is Dora Erbe-Matzke, and unfortunately, she couldn't be here. I don't know her personally, but I wish I could communicate to her, again, how proud we all are of her in this. Like Etienne, she's been involved in both sorts of things, doing it on her own and enabling others. In her case, the practice herself has been to do research in a huge variety of the sort of issues that we care about and publish on them, so including things on exploratory versus confirmatory research, adversarial collaborations, which is something we haven't talked much about here, pre-registration, replication, and meta-analysis, which will be more a topic of conversation tomorrow. So that's her own practice, but the way she's been enabling other people is to teach in so many different ways that, to design a couple of tools that enable people who already want to do it to do more open science, but also to teach in a variety of ways that you might not have thought of. So giving workshops, teaching courses, and also setting up statistical and other kinds of, and open science consulting at your own university, just so people could come there, and people who are interested in doing it, making it easier for them to do it. So the courses have, she's mostly engaged in the mathematics of it, the statistics, Bayesian software packaging, meta-analyses and things like that, but bringing forth this open science and that dimension has been really, she's influenced a lot of people through that way. So, award for Dora.
Okay, hi, I'm Kevin Esterling. I'm going to give the Political Science Awards out. And I think, as you guys all know, this is our first year giving out awards for the Leamer-Rosenthal Prize, and a number of us were on the selection committee. And but we weren't given any kind of instructions about what to look for what counts as meriting the award. We were basically told, I mean, we had some instructions, but basically we were told, just pick the people who you think most merit it. And there wasn't sort of a template for a winner. But we were talking at a meeting earlier today that really what stood out, and I think you saw it so far with all of the, at least for the emerging scholar ones that you guys have already seen, is what really stood out wasn't just that somebody was doing kind of exemplary work themselves, applying existing norms and living up to the existing standards, but really the people who won the awards are people who are building infrastructure, new infrastructure, or advancing new norms would be one way. And the other was if you were taking some kind of a risk to really kind of advance the norms of open science. And I think you saw that with the other emerging awards. But for political science, we have a great exemplar of each of those. By the way, if you want to win one of these awards next year, that's how you got to do it, it turns out. So, okay, so first up, we have Allan Dafoe. Allan's an assistant professor at Yale. He got his PhD right here at UC Berkeley in 2012. Berkeley. There's actually a Berkeley theme to the Political Science Awards. Oh, I should say that we have 2 Political Science Awards, but there had been a total of 12 applications, so it was pretty competitive. Okay, so Allan's an assistant professor at Yale. And I think in his teaching and research, he really exemplifies that template that I mentioned of somebody who's really building new institutions and advancing norms in political science. And so just to give some examples, he's developed novel ways to graphically display sensitivity tests for alternative model specifications, which again is very much in the spirit of what Ed was talking about, but you could think of it as sort of more of a graphical computational approach to doing that. But he's also developed code, R code, is it R code? Yeah, that makes it sort of easier for other people to do that. He has, published papers advocating for better replication practices in a prominent journal in political science. He's also helped to advance the very controversial DART, Data Access and Research Transparency Initiative that Skip Lupia here is spearheading in political science. And then finally, Allan's working on creating an online commons. I think he's talking to the Center for Open Science and some other people to try to develop an online commons to foster continuing dialogue around published papers. So there would be sort of this post-publication, ongoing dialogue about papers, sort of a post-publication peer review of papers, if you will. So that's really a major infrastructure effort that Allan has underway. And so the award committee really felt that Allan richly deserves the Emerging Scholar Research Award for having this kind of extensive portfolio of transparency efforts. So congratulations, Allan. Okay, this is our final award. So next up we have, wait a minute, who are these guys? I've never heard of them before. Did they do something this past year that deserves recognition? So I'll just consult my notes. And yes, so David Broockman, Joshua Kalla, and Peter Aronow are being recognized for their working paper entitled Irregularities in Liqueur 2014 this past spring. Seems like it was a lot longer ago than that, doesn't it? It was just this past spring. I was just joking when I was pretending I didn't know you guys. So anyway, so at the time, David and Josh were both graduate students here at UC Berkeley. There's something going on here at Berkeley. And then Peter was a relatively new assistant professor at Yale. And I think you guys are, pretty much everybody's going to be familiar with the story if you read the New York Times or anything else. But I have to do a quick synopsis that when David and Josh set out to replicate and extend this really interesting paper on contact and attitudes toward gay marriage that appeared in Science by Don Green and Michael LaCour. They got a hold of the replication data set, and they found some things that didn't quite look right. And so they got in touch with Peter, and they took a look. And long story short, they found some things like an implausibly high response rate to a survey, and then outcome measures from that survey that exhibited improbably high consistency over time. But then, more damning, that the change that appeared to occur over time just looked just like sort of added normally distributed noise, which was completely inconsistent with the kind of outcome measure. It's just something you wouldn't see in that kind of outcome measure over time. So upon seeing this report and the evidence of misconduct that followed from that, they gave the paper to Don Green, and Don Green requested that the paper be retracted. And so, here the award committee was really impressed by the fearlessness and determination that these junior scholars used. It's true. I was impressed, even while it was going on, that you were, graduate students and newly minted assistant professors, and you were, actually quite fearless and determined to make sure that the scientific record was set straight. And I think a lot that was lost in the media reporting was just how much the episode shows that science works, and it works in social science, that there might indeed be misconduct, but especially as these norms emerge, and that as we become more transparent, it's easier to detect these things, and it sort of is how the scientific record gets set straight. So again, the awards committee felt that their efforts embody and have done more than perhaps anything I can recall in social science to underscore the norms of open data and replication as a cornerstone of credible science. So you guys, congratulations. Just grab one. I guess I'm coming.